Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium Podcast. Today, my guest is Kathryn Julyan. Kathryn is doing her PhD at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and she teaches at Eastern Washington University. And today, we're talking about analytic philosophy, Indian philosophy, philosophy in graduate school, all of the above. Thanks for talking with me, Kathryn.
Yes, Sheb, thank you for having me.
So, I remember in some conversations we've had before that you said that you studied economics, like you were an economics major. Is that right, for your undergrad degree?
Yes.
And that was the path into philosophy for you.
Yes.
So could you just explain what happened there, how you got interested in philosophy from economics?
Yes. So just being raised in a family business, I started out as a business major, took some economic classes, was very inspired by a professor of economics at a junior college, and learned about Adam Smith first and foremost, and then several other philosophers of economic thought specifically. And so when I went to WSU to finish my degree, I was 3.5 years in, and then started taking philosophy. So I took critical thinking and logic and philosophy of psychology.
Okay.
So those were my first 3 courses.
Okay.
And then fell in love. So when I applied to graduate school, I applied to some economic programs and some philosophy programs.
Okay. And then you ended up going to Tufts.
Yes.
And they had a strong analytic philosophy program.
Yes.
So could you explain, when we talk about analytic philosophy, what does that mean?
Yes. I didn't know what it meant when I was accepted into the program.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I didn't have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, so that was one of the reasons why I applied to Tufts, because they kind of advertise themselves as being a philosophy program that was perfect to give someone a graduate education that would then lead them to earn a PhD.
Okay.
So that was primarily the reason I looked at Tufts, but I also was very enamored with the East Coast. So when I went and visited schools, I walked into Tufts, walked up the stairs, and I just knew immediately that was where I was going to be going to school.
Okay.
So analytic philosophy, as I was sharing with my students today, the history of philosophy is so rich. And I think ancient philosophy, of course, we learn about Socrates' dialectic and just that idea of sort of making that journey toward truth and goodness. And we don't come to anything conclusive, but we have that dialectic. And so we're looking at having disciplined dialogue. And then the medieval period, we have all these religious identified people who are really wrestling with the questions like, how do I understand where my faith begins and ends, and where philosophy begins and ends, and even science and logic, and what is the scope of each of these? And then by the time we get to the modern period, we still have religious identified, very prominent philosophers. We have Descartes, who's trying to argue for the necessary existence of God through logic alone. And then we have Kant telling us, well, we can only know things as they appear to us, but we cannot know things as they really are, conclusively, so to speak. And so I think in the sort of American English philosophical tradition, by the time we get past Kant, there's just a clear path to kind of not really inquiring into God anymore. Yeah. That kind of dropping out of metaphysics, kind of that inquiry into what's above and beyond physics. And of course, I didn't know any of this going into the program, but I certainly learned it firsthand when I arrived. And so analytic philosophy, its approach to metaphysics is very much looking at, understanding reality through symbolic logic and just trying to offer clarity about what we can know, which are things as they appear to us. Yeah. So kind of reality with a small r, let's say. Yeah. Uh-huh. And so as I was telling my students today, and I think Quine is such the perfect example of an analytic philosopher, but I was telling my students, he had this quote in one of his books that was, "What science says is true is true." And it was just so clear and succinct. And so I loved Quine because of that, even though I disagreed, but I just loved that it was so systematic, what his way of just being so clear about his position. And so, in class, his student, Hillary Putnam, and this was attending some classes, auditing some classes at Harvard. I just remember him, writing on the board, the statement, there is a cat on the mat, is true if and only if there is a cat on the mat.
Yeah.
And, I'm just sitting there kind of perplexed, like, this is what philosophy is?
Yeah.
Like, I've been a seeker my whole life, kind of reading the Bible and always having these bigger questions and always just being very philosophical. And so I was kind of confused. I was like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
But there was so much value to the skills that I was developing through being part of this program. It was very rigorous as far as presenting an argument. So for instance, like, if we take any of Aquinas' proofs, just presenting an argument and then seeing the logical form of it and being able to put it in, a syllogistic form.
Yeah.
And then being able to be very clear about, well, what premise is it that you disagree with,
right.
know? And that's what I really try to convey to my students, is really to distinguish between an argument that's logically valid, and we're very enamored by that.
Yeah.
Something's valid, we want to accept it as true because it just sounds good to our minds. They're designed that way. But then whether an argument is sound is a whole different thing.
Yeah.
And we have to be, very sort of, again, rigorous and just looking at the premises and what we're accepting in order to get that conclusion.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, the analytic tradition really contributes a lot.
Yeah.
Just to develop that skill. And I've moved beyond analytic philosophy, but I'm very indebted to it as well.
Yeah.
Especially in a climate where, we have in our popular culture just so much debate and so much, I would say, dialogue that's not disciplined.
Right.
And so for me, I sort of unplugged from all the political nonsense.
Yeah.
And just try to focus on, okay, how can I contribute to this? And how can I help make it better? And for me, it's like, if I can teach this skill
right.
of doing philosophy, no matter what religious or philosophical or spiritual tradition one, identifies with,
right.
then they have something to
right.
go out into that public space and have, more disciplined dialogue.
Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. So like, as human beings, regardless of what tradition we come from, we have to talk with each other, right? And ideally listen to each other, and being able to speak clearly would help us understand each other. And if philosophy helps us do that, then that's a good thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And even just, conversations I've had with you, and even the conversation we had about women in ethics, it's very coming from very different, universities, but being able to just come together and really have that, dialogue
right.
that helps us deepen our understanding, gain clarity.
Right.
It's a value.
Yeah. So you've mentioned that at Tufts, with this like strong analytic focus there, that there was also kind of a culture of like, well, we can kind of talk about God as though he doesn't exist. And that's kind of the general atmosphere of the philosophy department there. Was that right? Or
well, I would put it this way. I feel like post-Kant, we've then created spaces for agnosticism, so this idea that we cannot know.
Right.
And so at that point, people who kind of just fall into that philosophical tradition or commitment, there can be a full spectrum of the religious and spiritual practices.
Sure.
They can still be Buddhist or Jewish or Christian, so there's a strong agnostic tradition in a lot of world religions.
Yeah.
And then I feel like atheism is just that step further, like we cannot know with the primary methods of knowing, rationalism, empiricism, logic, and science.
Yeah.
And that's definitive. And so in that way, the commitment is that there is no God.
Yeah.
And so philosophers who identify with atheism, there's just a much more firmer commitment. You know, it's not only I cannot know, but God does not exist.
Yeah.
Because if God existed, we'd be able to prove it the way we prove everything else in the world.
Right.
And we can't, so thus God does not exist.
Right.
So at Tufts, this was the predominant position.
Okay.
And it was very out in the open.
Okay.
So I would say, you know, logical positivism during this, you know, time in the late 20th century, like this is just, was pretty much the mainstream philosophical position in American and English philosophy.
Yeah. Could you briefly explain what logical positivism, what that movement was about?
Well, I mean, I would just very simply say that we can only know through logic. And so whatever can't be revealed through logic doesn't really qualify as actual knowledge. And so in that sense, again, any statement that we're going to make that lies outside that scope is then mystical faith. You know, it's based on something that's not valid. You know, and that can't be taken as the foundation for actual knowledge.
Right. So this school of thought would focus heavily on like, well, the way we know things is by like tightening and clarifying our language. And like, if we can't even speak coherently about these things, then we can't even get at them, and we can kind of do away with it. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that would be a fair statement.
Okay. Yeah, and I think you mentioned like at some point you came into class and like your professor was laying out a technical argument for God doesn't exist or something.
Yes. So I had a professor, and I remember Professor Smith, and I remember he had a class on God, and I think it was just titled On God.
Okay.
But in the class, what was presented were a very detailed argument showing the necessary non-existence of God.
Okay.
And it was all in symbolic logic.
Okay.
So the
lots
P's
of letters.
and Q's
Yeah.
and lots of,
Yeah.
So I remember walking to the room, every white bird in the room, and it was an advanced class. It was like 400 level. And I remember just going, whoa,
Yeah.
what have I stepped into? And what was even more interesting is that apparently this proof came to him in a dream.
Okay.
So, this was just one of the moments in my academic career where I was really taken aback.
Yeah.
That there was this very linear, logical argument that this professor came up with in a dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is, a non-rational space.
Sure.
In my opinion, for the most part.
Right.
So it was just very, very interesting. And I didn't end up completing the class. I wasn't really interested in inquiring into the existence of God in that way.
Yeah.
It kind of didn't resonate.
Yeah.
So, but I did take a course by Professor Daniel Dennett, on Consciousness Explained. So that was, that to me was more, I guess, rich and kind of providing some resources to really inquire into, the depth of consciousness and a greater reality, in a kind of different way. So.
Okay. Wow. So Daniel Dennett's like a very prominent atheist. Did his atheism, did he bring that up in the class or not? Was that kind of a separate?
Again, this was a label that was just on the surface. So everyone knew it. It wasn't anything that we had any deep conversations about, or at least I didn't.
Okay.
But it was just an assumption.
Okay. It was taken for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So then you graduated from Tufts, and when did you get started? Because now you're doing your PhD work in Indian philosophy. So tell us how you got interested in Indian philosophy.
Yes. Well, it really was this class on Consciousness Explained where, and I love Professor Dennett, and he actually has a really great TED Talk on valuing the study of world religions, which I really value because, again, was a student of his years back when I don't think he would have devoted that much time to talking about religions as something that had, value. So I really appreciate where these conversations have gone with some of these atheist thinkers, and Daniel Dennett's one of them, and Sam Harris is another. So I appreciate their work and value their work. So, but I disagreed, or the position didn't resonate to me, that we could explain consciousness through empiricism. So I was always kind of more on that, well, don't we have to start with this amness, that sort of idea even that Descartes starts with, I know that I am. And then he follows up on that. We say, I think, therefore I am, but really it's the amness that is indubitable. I mean, that's where he begins.
Yeah.
So I was very interested in, I guess, that experience of consciousness and what it was, what it reveals, what the meaning of consciousness is. And so then I took a yoga class. I mean, it sounds really kind of, but I took a yoga class, and I literally walked out of this gym where I took my first yoga class and just passed this young man. And for some reason, like, we just kind of, caught eyes, and they ended up buying me this book on, he was Indian, actually, subcontinent Indian. He ended up buying me this book on Indian philosophy.
Okay.
That was sort of the beginning of my path in studying Indian philosophy. So yoga was always first a philosophy, then just, a set of physical exercises, I would say. So I've always had a very deep appreciation for the tradition as a philosophy.
Yeah.
And so I just really studied yoga just informally for 6, 7, 8 years.
Okay.
So I started at CIIS the late 2000s, and I'm still completing my dissertation.
Okay.
So it's been kind of, I'm wondering if there's a Guinness World Record. Taking the longest to complete a dissertation. But I had to learn Sanskrit. And so I had to take 2 years of Sanskrit, and that wasn't available here. I also had to commute to San Francisco to take all my coursework. So it took a lot to pursue that, but it was the only PhD program that resonated in the sense of what I wanted to study more deeply.
Yeah. And now, do you feel like your background in analytic philosophy and the work you're doing, any areas of overlap, or do you feel like these are kind of two different spheres, or how do you think about that?
Well, Indian philosophy, so there's 9 systems altogether, and there is a very strong tradition of logic, Nyaya logic. And interestingly, the ways of knowing that are considered valid have slightly wider scope than the American English tradition.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, there's a space for supersensory intuition. So there's these categories that, to me, are more mystical from an Eastern perspective, more spiritual, but are considered valid in these traditions. And of course, they also have testimony. So all the, historical religions and even ahistorical religions that have texts, sacred texts, testimony is part of how we know these traditions. So what's interesting is they have these 3 words, which basically translate as hearing and working it through in your mind. And that's where the analytic philosophy would contribute. Clearing your doubts is how I would say it. So you listen, and there has to be a teacher who has the knowledge, who's teaching the text verse by verse. So say it's the Bhagavad Gita, verse by verse. And then a student who has developed certain virtues and qualities that they're able to gain the knowledge. So it's not a bucket with holes in it, so to speak. Right. So they listen, and then working through your doubts. So, and I think in any tradition, this is where, any religious spiritual tradition, this is where those analytical skills really help us.
Yeah.
So that we're not just, believing things just sort of foolhardily, but we actually have thought through what we believe.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, those skills can be really important in all spiritual religious traditions.
But maybe that's like a common misunderstanding of religious traditions, is that there's an expectation that you wouldn't try and think about this, right? But most religious traditions do have a strong sense of like, we want you to think about these things, right?
Yes. I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that's where philosophy is so necessary to religion. And I think, religious identified individuals, we bear a responsibility to clear our doubts, think through things, and really be clear about why we believe what we believe.
Yeah.
And to understand it in ways that we can also create pathways of connection to people who identify in other traditions.
Right.
And so, yes, I agree wholeheartedly.
Okay.
And then the third is just contemplation.
Okay.
So it's like listening, working through your doubts, and then just kind of realizing the truth and sitting in the truth.
Okay.
And so those three things are kind of what are the sort of levels of learning in the Indian philosophical tradition.
Okay. So the last question I wanted to ask you is, like, having gone through a master's program and now you're doing this PhD program and you're also teaching philosophy, and maybe this is still something you're in the middle of, but like, what kinds of thoughts would you have about people wanting to go on to get like a graduate degree in philosophy, or just majoring in philosophy, pursuing a career in philosophy? What are your thoughts about that?
I definitely see value in earning a bachelor degree in philosophy.
Okay.
Because so many undergraduate degree programs, are programs that you can use as a platform to graduate study.
Yeah.
So you don't, and you can always take those extra courses you need to take to do something different in graduate school. So if someone had an interest in philosophy, I see some undergraduate students, and maybe they even want to become a physician, or whatever it is they want to do. But I feel like philosophy as, say, a double major or even a minor is so important. So if there's that interest, I would so encourage that individual to pursue it in addition to whatever else they're studying. Or if they have such a passion and they, I want to teach this, or I want to start my own podcast. We'll see what philosophers are doing in the next decade.
Right,
It's all changing. But I would definitely encourage students. But I would say that I think if you decide to pursue a graduate degree in philosophy, it should be because you can't help yourself.
Yeah.
There's no other choice. Like, this is your dharma, as we say in Indian philosophy, your path, and you just can't help but do it.
Right.
Because it is something that, requires a lot of passion to want to pursue something that there's no guarantee professionally, where it will lead, at a graduate level.
Yeah.
And I would say that what I would love to see is more informal philosophers, people who have even just taken a handful of undergraduate courses, but are committed to disciplined dialogue in the world.
Yeah.
And one of the most, influential philosophers in my life is not a formally trained philosopher. So I highly value that skill of disciplined dialogue. I want to see that out in the world. More and more.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, disciplined dialogue. I think we could definitely use more of it. Was there anything else, Kathryn, you wanted to mention about philosophy, analytic philosophy, Indian philosophy?
Yeah, I think, again, just like what we left on, I just really, and that term is used in the introductory text that I'm using now to kind of describe what Socrates contributed to the Western philosophical tradition. And I like that term as well, disciplined dialogue, because I think it just really is on point in regards to telling,
naming
what we need more of in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that it has such incredible value. And I honestly think philosophy, that we could have a golden age of philosophy now because we need it more than ever.
Yeah.
I think we're actually in desperate need of philosophy for philosophers to do it the way, according to our tradition, have disciplined dialogue. And, I tell my students that I try to invite them in and to come with me into the abyss of the unknown, and that what I do not know is infinite and what I do know is finite.
Yeah.
And so as philosophers, we have to humble ourselves because it's not conclusive, but we can still journey toward truth and goodness.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Socrates' narrative contributes to our civilization. And it's important that we carry it on.
Carry that on, yeah. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and please share with your friends.